Hello everyone, today we talk about Mediterranean hegemonies in the last millennium of antiquity. So we will essentially take a look at the major powers that ruled over the Mediterranean, also the Near East, since the beginning, this shift fundamentally, the center of power towards the east, gradually towards the west, ended with Rome, and this gradual becoming, right, in the path of developed societies only from a relatively few, right? Considering at least counting the millennia previously, there would be an interesting chapter to open about those theories that pretend, at least, that there had been something before in terms of mysterious civilization disappeared. I can't say I'm completely against it in the sense that, of course, there is something to it as a general, but there is not a concrete proof of it. The only point that it's indeed true is that considering the history of the world, the various relics, especially of societies that existed some there at a point, if you look what our civilization, the history that we start to recollect is just a minimal part of the whole chronological spectrum. There are also areas of the world that are not being dug, right? And it's rare to find certain relics of many years ago. So in theory, it would be possible for a civilization on, I don't know, the same level, I don't know, what the Romans had been, might have existed at some point, right? It's total speculation, but it's conceivable, right? But this is completely a different thing from today. Probably many of you will unsubscribe just for this statement, but philosophically, believe me, I don't comment much this kind of theories myself, because I do like it in potential, but then you must have the evidence for it, right? And which doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but it just means that the only way we can talk about it is either by speculation or by evidence, right? And there is naturally a big difference between the two things. Why do I say this, though? Really, it's for a consideration that I'm bringing on the fore from some time now, that is properly acquainting ourselves to the idea that objectively there is a chronological spectrum of improvement of civilization. That is something that I think is sometimes flattened in a bit of a relativistic terms. That is to say, more or less we extrapolate, at least from history, a certain power, a certain culture, a certain civilization. We say that was it, right? And let's transpose it on a system of judgment that is mostly actually based on today's moral standards. And let's pretend that everything was equal, and therefore we cannot really say, that at one time in history there was a world that functioned better than another, or at least that had in its own context the capacities and the possibilities to achieve something that others, unfortunately for them, didn't. I point this out because it seems to me that we are flattening properly the concept of the root of civilization, right? It mostly becomes, the historical interest seems to have become mostly about, that is my thing back in the past, so I will back it because it's my own, right? And what is my own also at thousands of years of distance is, quite puzzling, and you would even wonder why someone would come up with that. But there is something that is, probably the only thing that would be worth remembering in this regard, because also we come after this and we come on top of this, on the shoulders of this, is properly the improvement in itself. And when it comes to this point, that the previous mentality of my own thing goes to screw itself, because you realize fundamentally that the history of civilization, it's not the history much of cultures, right? Cultures, I give you that, they cannot properly be compared in a positive sense, right? You unless you're not making a comparison. I don't know, anthropology works like this. You're trying to figure out whether there are certain features in common between certain cultural systems, historical, but that's mostly surpassed today as a form properly of interpretation. Today, maybe even a bit too much, they stress the differences rather, and I don't like culturalism at all either. But when, as far as civilization is concerned, right, I think really that it is important to point out the actual improvement. I mean, it's something you can't even almost materially quantify, right? It's not that we historically looked at certain realities because it necessarily was just a matter of nationalism or ideology. Certain civilizations achieved, and more than others, but also they left a mark that others didn't, right? So you can, of course, be interested in every kind of culture. It doesn't mean anything. You can't say that, I don't know, I don't like, therefore, tribes because, those were, accomplished less overall. It doesn't mean anything, right? We all come from tribes, but we all, in fact, at this point in history, those tribes changed, improved, they became something else. And after all, I presume when we study history, that's what we are tracking, right? I think the single most important aspect of it is how the hell did we do it, given the difficulties that we have, even still today, to figure out the direction where we're going, right? There are naturally also many philosophies of history that stress the fact, even there, in my opinion, in a bit too relativistic sense, as far as especially the scientific, biological evidence is concerned, that, history might have gone, not obviously in very different ways, but, it could have gone up and down on the base of basically, I mean, as if our own improvement today in this path that we consider, in a sense, linear, or at least, positive in a way, it's pure chance. I do not believe so. I believe that humans do things because they want substantially to improve, and because they have this constant need, right, and the capacities to achieve it. So, of course, history might have gone in radical different ways, and we realize it. During the Cold War, we could simply wipe out ourselves, and there is enough room for that to happen quite easily at some point, right? History in this sense is not predictable. Deterministic interpretations are definitely bad, right? Because they kill the historical criticism per se. But I still presume that as far as the human intelligence is concerned, well, civilization is capable of measuring that, and its own accomplishments, its own achievements. Another unfortunate attitude that is spreading today is, in fact, this kind of nativistic, tribalistic mindset for which someone falls into this delusion that once upon a time there was a people that was, pure and just and happy and, and loving, and that at certain point some brute arrived and exterminated him because he was just evil, right? Unfortunately, this is also a very naive perception of history, because when we study these cultures, these civilizations, there is one unique common denominator. That is fundamentally the fact that all of these cultures, and I mean all of them, there was not even one that didn't do this, and this has nothing to do with ideals, with systems, etc. All these peoples, all our ancestors did basically nothing else, basically, but exterminating, enslaving, and raping. Now, if the concept is that you cannot accept it because in the 21st century you cannot, be intelligent enough, given our astonishing achievement in civilization, to understand a thing like historical context, this does not mean that you cannot judge that morally, but you cannot be a puritanic fanatic pretending to change history to make you feel better about whatever your ancestors were. Your ancestors, whoever you are, were exterminators, enslavers, and rapists, and nothing else for most of human existence, right? We call civilization what objectively didn't necessarily take that out, but at a certain point we definitely did, because surely the world we live in is not, even in here, just about exterminating, enslaving, and raping, right? Or at least it is in a absolutely more reduced way, in considering also the thing in relative terms to our own reality, right? Maybe we do more harm today, but there is no comparison between also the good that we do today in terms of literally life quality improvement and so on. Civilizations are the things that exterminated, enslaved, and raped, but also on the top of this did something freaking intelligent, positive, and construct that allowed to improve this. And this condition, which, believe me, already at the time wasn't considered proper, right? I can't think properly of a culture that doesn't know the concept, let's say, of good and evil in a simplistic way, because that's a simple mental dichotomy that surely realizes that there is the existence of a wrongdoing. This is something you find in every philosophy, in every religion, right? There is the concept of sin, of something that you don't have to do. We know that, anthropologically speaking, we regulate our own societies, and that's already a step of civilization. All human societies did since prehistorical times. So that's the long path that it took. However, in an incredibly accelerated way in the last millennia, a bit more than 10,000 years ago, we were all hunter-gatherers. And the idea is that we dramatically improved on the base of concrete capacities, of what we study in history. So if your memory is so short, or if your horizons are so narrow that to you the way of comparing a civilization is just taking a people extracted from its context, another people extracted from its context, and pretending to deny that one was fundamentally doing what we said basically they all did, so that you can feel righteous because, in 1,000 years you think that those are your ancestors, that this confers you I don't know what, because I don't think I don't get the connection. But just know that this is utterly pathetic, right? And what we can be proud of is the common value of this civilization. I mean, the idea that, very far from the other bullshit of cultural appropriation, it is something so disgusting that in fact alt-righters and leftists decided to embrace altogether, and that is also one of the greatest idiocies you can come up with. Civilization is founded exactly on the capacity of learning, borrowing or stealing, if you're so obsessed by this thing, from other cultures. And that the cultures that eventually make it to become civilizations are exactly the ones that are already advanced to absorb successfully another notion, another capacity, right? Another know-how specifically. And this has nothing to do with making, the other poor, cultures being stolen its own thing on a pedestal, because it's not the case, right? But most people assume that this is the thing, right? And always for those reasons that are very ideological, very political. And the interesting thing of this is also, historiographically speaking, that you can recognize how people in mass culture, in very recently, in the last century, I presume, or maybe slightly more, but very few centuries actually, had fundamentally largely a positive appreciation of civilization. You may say, well, but because the elites mostly ruled and they wanted to stress the importance of the great rulers and the things. Well, probably not, right? This was very much shared in the realization of the practical benefits that derived from civilization. I mean, it's just in the 21st century, when you can spend your life, eating chips on a sofa watching Netflix, that you can put in relation certain concepts like, the importance of hierarchy or discipline or of the elites in a society that surely also needs its own liberty, autonomy, and social, change and transformation. And it did, right? And the history of civilization is exactly this, right? Another great thing that history has taught us is that societies are not crystal monoliths that do not change. Societies always change, right? And there is no way to even draw a precise boundary around them, right? So also about the myth of cultural appropriation, it's exactly this: is pretending that things like an idea are fundamentally can be branded as a product of one people. It would be the product of one person, right? Do you think that, I don't know, you can be proud that one scientist at some point invented something because it belonged to your same country, right? What's your personal merit from it? What's your national pride deriving from it, right? It can arrive if you're taught to know what that person did. If you understand properly what it is, that's the moment in which you can become proud of owning that specific knowledge and capacity, and that's a universal good, right? That's a true good of civilization. Who doesn't understand it remains behind. This is what history taught us. Most of the time, most people remain behind in a way. There is a dramatic dynamic in the history of civilization. This is very well known to the historians of economy, of technology, of science. But civilization doesn't improve because there is the progressivistic, positivistic magic powder from the fairies that makes skyscrapers grow and planes to fly, right? The history of science and technology is marked essentially by the idea that you improve just because you fail, right? The entire product of civilization is a product of pain, sufferance, failure, destruction, death. And this is pretty clear. The interesting thing is that this is not a realization we came up today with. This is something that even if you read, I don't know, the poem of Gilgamesh or the Bible, it's there. It tells you that, right? That civilization entails suffering, because if we were in the Garden of Eden, nobody would need civilization because we would have everything. And this is a very deep, actually very scientifically accurate, for our own standards, a precisely accurate depiction of the human condition and its relation with civilization. So we also should get acquainted to the idea that we object that there is no positive end, that life ends in misery, in death, in pain, in sufferance, and it's like this for everybody. Sorry for ruining you the evening, but there is no happy ending in all this. Also because we will, at some point, also disappear as a species. That the world will die, right? The sun will, switch off, and that's it, right? But still, there is a sense that if there is a sense we can make of this on Earth, and don't ask me what there is beyond that. It's exactly recognizing the value of this relative improvement, that as relative as it is, it functions, it worked, right? Denying the history of civilization, putting in relation a tribal moral system to the one of a modern state, is denying the value of science, is denying the value of the attempts and the application and the exertions of those people that came up with the knowledge, the capacity, the wealth, that you have. And I don't think the masses are being properly educated in this. The masses are being educated now to be lied, mostly to think that they're special for some undeserved and actually not owned reason, right? What they look like. I mean, the most stupid things. I mean, the things that they don't have practically anything to do with any intelligent application, which is what civilization is. Because objectively, it's much easier to feed them with bullshit, right? and to control it, which is also what civilizations did in part, because let's be honest, if a person is dumb at some point, unless it's coerced, you can have more problems with that, but it's fine to exploit its stupidity, right? That's what we all do. Why do you think that, I don't know, advertisements exist? Why, that it's based on on lying. It's based on fiction. We all know that, right? But in a way we still fall for it largely. So what is this premise for? This premise is for making us realize naturally in a more concrete way the value of the path that brought to our own civilization. I often speak of the West, right? And because I presume that that there is something that can be defined, but one day you should make a courageous video about it. That is to say, what is the West, right? Given that I know that it doesn't properly exist as the West, and there are very complicated problems even to define the who's who in a way. But I presume that by approximation it does exist, and it's something actually very precise. I can speak for China, I can speak for other also civilizations at some point were wiped out, by the way, by us, which is also another those things that should be a bit more refocused in a way, because once again, most of the times, as we were saying before, the moral standards is if that person exterminated someone else, these are the bad and evil, right? And there is no way around it. Well, but what were the others doing, right? Like that's a serious thing. I mean, it's like, think about whatever native can claim its own land. Nobody doubts that there is a value in your own land. There is a right in what you feel you wanna be, and that's how that, however, enters in the political negotiation, right? There are certain movements that I've seen about natives that objectively sound identical to Blutenboden and ethno-nationalism in other contexts that, including national socialism or something like that, that you wonder, wait a second, but this is basically the same thing. Well, civilization helps you to understand that in spite of that dark side of the same civilization, there is still, however, an improvement of some sort, right? In the 21st century, I presume that except some community that really struggles for its own independence in contexts that are actually pretty serious, the majority of activists that are the ones that you only hear of, because the serious things here in the world unfortunately are not heard, are just a bunch of spoiled brats who are the product of the same civilization they're criticizing, because they went to their schools, they learned their same values, they don't objectively have a different lifestyle, and even complain of the fact that they are what they are, where there are people that are actually dying, being tortured, being exterminated, right? And this is really the problem with today's world, I presume, because if you lose the plot about this perspective, it's first of all a declaration of historical ignorance, but beyond ignorance, right? This is not knowing a date or a name. This is being illiterate. That is to say, you have problems to distinguish stories from history. Secondly, the question goes, well, if that's your moral system fundamentally, what chances are that you can be beneficial to civilization? That is to say, if you reason like a tribalist, that could be easily, but maybe not, because at that point you would realize how idiotic it is. 2,000 years ago, you're not just a burden to society, but you're also a threat to civilization. And do not think that, as we were saying before, that there is an improvement. Generally speaking, there are certain conditions that can even prevent us to do something stupid at certain levels. But do not think that civilization will constantly improve. I mean, the tendency is to constantly improve, but it has nothing to do with the fact that objectively, yes, it can come back to everything can back to the Stone Age at some point, right? And that depends on your capacity to understand things like politics, society, and war, which without history is not possible. Therefore, if you do not know that, you basically will mishandle your power and will commit disasters, right? And I'm pretty concerned about this because in spite we come from a pretty dark world, but I presume that, I don't know, at some point it was I can say necessarily a greater responsibility, but there was the sense that at least there was a condition of imminent threat for which you had to find practical solutions. To me now, the practical solutions are becoming more difficult, right? We're still at to be found among common people. It is true that at this point we need mostly theoretical capacities, and yet we still lack this because as a civilization we came up with the need of a theoretical thinking only from 100 years, right? It's something that humanity is not used to, just even in the most recent path of civilization. It's something like 1/4 of it. I mean, we have not gotten accomplished to that, and it will take some time, right? Hopefully not too long, because in the meanwhile things could turn dramatically worse as a consequence, and in part we're already suffering that. So I'm glad at least I could address this issue, because I think really it focuses, it gets straight to the point, right? I'm not interested to make properly a hierarchy of civilization, but there's also no a way around the fact that certain peoples did contribute in a way that is more or less than others, right? And then naturally it's the responsibility of also people who've got in between to receive that or not. That's also why we have this responsibility of keeping pretty clearly in mind what this whole thing has been about. So today's topic is something atrociously unlikely to address completely, right? I don't even know why I came up with this, but it is based on the idea that there were quite strong forces fundamentally that shaped the world we know, and that were strong as harsh as we've seen, and that we need to get acquainted to the destructive capacity of civilization that objectively increases the more civilization is advanced. I mean, look at our own capacities today, right? So the myth, first of all, that a civilization doesn't destroy so that we are actually barbarians because of violence of it is no historical thing, right? Civilizations, and mostly here, are powerful and do exercise their power to maintain themselves, and that's completely normal because it's actually what every single society does, right? It's not that an empire was intrinsically different, especially 2,000 years ago, from a tribe. They basically believed in the same identical thing, that it was right to, as we were saying before, exterminate, enslave, and rape, as long as basically you were able to do it, because if you were able to do it, it was not your own thing, it was the gods that had allowed you to be. So you were deserving that as a prize, right? So the cornerstone of all what we're really talking about today, of every single culture, from the first to the last, is the conqueror has the right to do whatever he wants on the conquered. And there is no people here that didn't believe it, and that didn't believe it even for 1 second. The entire world knew exclusively at the time that we improved, right? There is a history of thought, there is a history of philosophy. It took time, a lot of time, and something began here and there to appear exactly in the ancient world, right? It will try to explain, maybe not precisely why today, but at least what we can learn from the premises of it. And was it? It was it. No, but no culture knew something more than this. There were other cultures that expressed values that are to be found historically in the fringes of society, in the extremism, that are as idealistic as violent, right? Even pacifistic ideas turn out to be some of the most violent in practice, because they're absolute, right? And civilization is based on political negotiation, which is something that is compromising. That's a value of civilization in a way. Absolute standpoints refuse compromise and therefore are dangerous ideologies that in fact civilizations have fundamentally never fully embraced, right? Even if you look, I don't know, look at Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, well, those were realities that were not fully behaving, right, in spite of the massacres and devastation and so on, at the utmost of their capacity. There was always a political and social attrition, and especially they existed because properly they were backed by the people. Never forget this, right? The myth that these poor populations were under terrible regimes, and it's all false. These were populations who were actively believing in the righteousness of invading another place, getting rid of who was there and were in another, and ruling in their stead, right? So in getting rid means also not necessarily you have to exterminate them because you think that they are an inferior race like National Socialism wanted. Socialism was able to do that pretty damn well without conceiving the idea. I'm properly thinking of an imperialistic idea of controlling a people and exploiting it. Also, the Nazis, postponed the extermination, I don't know, the Slavs of other peoples because of course they needed them to win the war, and they also mishandled it among the many other things in the broader failure of the total failure of their even properly strictly military activity. But because once again that's not an ideal absolute world. If you invade, I don't know, a country like the Ukraine during Barbarossa, and you need those Slavs to fight, from their nationalistic standpoint against the communists and so on. There are actually, imperialist Russian transvestites in disguise. I'm not saying that literally the Soviet Union was just the Tsarist Empire and under in disguise, let's say, but there was much to it in terms of the centrality of Russia over the other Soviets and so on. But this is just an example of how objectively the world also cannot be cut like simply that it's all a shade, right? There is not a specific thing, a culture, a people, an idea that you can say, well, here it begins and here it stops. This never existed historically speaking. It's a extremistic delusion. It's also a very dangerous ideological standpoint because it really opens to the idea, well, but what if we get rid of the ones that do not work in that regard? And the idea is as brutal as radical, and it doesn't take into consideration the benefits that derive from a joint improvement, which is exactly what civilization aims at. So history also teaches us that very extremistic civilizations, let's say, it sounds ugly to call, I don't know, but we also should get acquainted to this. I mean, objectively, yes, Nazi Germany or Soviet, of the Soviet Union were a civilization. They had civilization capabilities. They were hell of civilization. If you look at the history of mankind, it's just that they took it dramatically far because of their ideologies that were pretty idiotic, in fact, in their own way, and failed. Because what is idiotic, in terms of a civilization which is based on intelligence, fails, right? The sad side of the story that really expresses why, things can go worse in the process, and that civilization is also something extremely fragile, it requires a specific capacity, is that these regimes took down with them hundreds of millions of people, most of whom were completely innocent of any guilt, right? And for that insanity. So the question here is, were we kidding, right? How can you look at the past of the world and saying, that people was just I don't know, because it was invaded, while it was just based on it, once again, and I want to repeat it over and over again ad nauseam, extermination, slavery, and rapes. Where does it get it, right? If you meet a serial killer, a a slave owner or a rapist, what are your immediate feelings towards this person, right? You could contextualize maybe the thing, like if you literally extrapolated an ancient warrior from its context. These were serial psychopaths, and that's what they spent their entire life doing. But at least that it's that context. So why do you criticize, for example, an empire that comes to that people and exterminates it, while that tribe was basically doing was the same identical thing? I mean, where's the moral standard? What literally the improvement in civilization stemming from this idea? That you're a bigot, that you're narrow-minded, you can't see the most evident reality of these wars. And naturally, the more you ignore, and the more you can, justify this. That's why certain ideologies are a declaration of illiteracy at many levels, not just historical. Because that's exactly the point. So when you look at the ancient world, make a big effort to say, okay, this was a world of horror, but let's point out that for something that someone did at that point, that we today have something that otherwise we wouldn't have had. And not only that, but consider that there wasn't anything teleological or deterministic for getting to have that, right? The rise of Greece, the rise of Rome are not things that you can give for granted because it had to happen, because it was their turn, right? Things could go very differently at many points. It would have had a completely different history. So that's a reason more, not just to appreciate what we have, but also not to be dogmatic about it, but also in any sense. So not taking standpoints, I don't like these things. Well, you don't have to like them. You have to understand them. And when you understand what was accomplished by them, you'll say, wow, then I realize why they were important. That's why we need to know about them, and why any whining about the fact that a tribe was taken out in the process is as tragic as it objectively is from any standpoint. The question is, what would have the existence of the tribe helped to get over the thing? That tribe might have been the next oppressor of another people, and it literally happened because just if you know the history of these realities, you know that more or less they were trying all to check each other in the same identical way. There was not a tribe that stood there and said, okay, then we just want to live in peace because we are free and pure and brave and great. What they believed from birth to death, we could even say, was, I want to become powerful and I don't care what stands in between. Or at least I do, as far as maybe my own community is concerned, and we know that of course these societies were very much regulated, but as far as your neighbors were, if you got a fair agreement with them, fine, otherwise take them out. These are not things we teach our kids in schools, right? We basically adulterated all this history from the violence of it, because we believed after World War II that we would talk about violence, we would turn them into other Nazis. The effect is exactly the opposite. Now, these people have no civic civilization. If you wonder even the difference between a cultural civilization, just look at the etymology of the word. These people are civic illiterates that do not know the difference between anything in history, because you didn't even teach them what violence is and what's, for example, the intrinsic nature of a political, the intrinsic violence of any political option, right? At the point that these people will not understand how they can even behave with others, you just bust them down a forced ideology that basically taught them to receive any other ideology of the same kind, so that they can be the next Nazis of the new generations. The only way to prevent things like these to happen is exactly to tell what the historical reality was. Because there is a historical reality, right? The truth maybe is something else, which is more complicated, but it's exactly seeking for that truth that teaches you how to be critically skilled. And if you until you don't start to study the thing, until you are not acquainted to even just to the dimensional side of these stories. I mean, obviously you can evaluate the measure of civilization even just by realizing what these people accomplished on the base of sources of evidence, right? I must confess I'm touring around, a specific issue I would like to address, but I don't, because otherwise I think I'm too ideological myself. But you know, also the chronological perspective. You cannot be fixated just, I don't know, on the ancient world because you played too much video games about it when you were younger, and I don't know, ignoring the Middle Ages or even what came before the ancient world, we could say, prehistory, or ignoring modern history or contemporary history, because you are more, impacted by all what came later, in a way, together with what happened before, of course, in a more immediate way, let's say, than in fact you are with what happened in the past, and you're not objective until you don't get the whole picture right. So once again, to project your political delusions on a world of 2,000 years ago without even having a specific knowledge of sources, without knowing even how to translate them, the question is, what the hell are you talking about? That's the thing, right? All right, so we can start from let's start from the beginning, the Punic War, going actually back and forth. The first Punic War, I mean, back and forth to how we got to that point. Like during the first century BC, we can observe the full maturity of this process that started more or less 2 centuries before, with the beginning of the Punic Wars in 264 BC. The Punic Wars are, strangely enough, no, we haven't discussed them much, but I think many of you are well acquainted to them. I've seen it even just among the comments that there are interesting remarks. Today we skip everything, we make a synthesis of, a brutal synthesis of everything. So this has stemmed, of course, as a war, and previously as a conflict between the Republic of Rome, that had from a short time basically become master of the Italic peninsula, and that up to that point had also not manifested nor the capacity nor interest to affirm its control on the seas, right? And that's also a bit cut too much with the hatchet, but there is some truth in this idea. And naturally the city of Carthage, that was center of a originally Phoenician culture that had, however, deeply Hellenized in over time, and which was, on the contrary from Rome, the center of a system of maritime emporia that dominated, placed as it is on the channel of Sicily, the commercial routes between the eastern and the western basin of the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars, as you know, are central as far as the rise of Rome especially is concerned. Objectively, the Second Punic War was not the most dangerous moment in which Rome could be stopped, but technically it could happen. The fact it didn't doesn't mean that it could have not happened. Had, Asdrubal won the Metaurus River, or other, even, there had been a different, but that's already a bit too imaginific, relation between the Italics and Rome. We talked recently about the social war that came later, but still touched the issues of the Roman Confederacy and so on. Objectively, we might have had something different. Carthage didn't have nor the resources nor the manpower to dominate the Italic peninsula. It would have remained fundamentally a fragmented reality of Oscan confederacy, let's say, with its markets open to Carthage, that would have benefited greatly. And who knows, maybe at some point the Carthaginians could have expanded even in the peninsula and so on. But that's all a what if. But just saying how it was possible, still to that point, to stamp Rome in a way. That's another topic that I'm sure many of you will have something to say this is not true, or I have a different opinion. Yes, I know, but we will talk about it another time, because objectively you deserve better than these 2 lines. And it's even here, never think everything was deterministically founded, right? Of course, eventually what happened doesn't give us the impression that things might have turned differently, but still, right? Things might have gone very differently, right? But I don't know. Just think of all the great historical characters that simply didn't exist because at the time, I don't know, they died together with their mothers at birth, right? It's one of those things that you can't say, it had to go like that. What would have been the world today without Augustus? Let's be honest about it. It would have been radically different, but very radically, and it has nothing to do with, the system of Rome would have gone on. Surely, it would have gone on, but without that person, it would have gone on in very different ways, right? This is just it's dialectical, right? It's the dialectical exercise, nothing else, but it makes you acquainted to the extreme fluidity of this world, which also it makes, paradoxically, the history, how it went, way more appreciated, because even here, in terms of civilization, it makes you understand the actual intelligence and capacity of those who succeeded in this mess, right? It's luck as well, yes, as hell. As Clausewitzians, we know that luck is there, but it's a combination. It's not even luck alone, right? So with the Punic Wars, especially the second, Rome is finally convinced of taking the further step of creating a literal empire, right? Of coming out of Italy and expanding. And that was something that the Romans, in spite of their militaristic mentality, surely didn't share wholly, especially in the most traditionalist aristocracy at that point, right? It was this idea that, in theory, it was better to remain in Italy because, it's dangerous to go out there. Well, there would have not been a Roman Empire without that. And eventually, in fact, we look at even figures like Scipio and of all those who eventually pushed for the further expansion, this other mindset that was also considered non-Roman at the time, right? That's another thing of what's a culture, like what's Roman. Scipio was considered an Hellenist, fundamentally, a dangerous, would-be Hellenistic tyrant by the traditionalist side of the same faction of the same. And we can't even say that it was very far from the truth as an idea, but it contained in there a fruit of civilization for which, without Spain, without Zama, there would have not even been an end of the Punic Wars. Like, the third one would have been, but if the Romans had not struck the Carthaginians in Africa, surely there would have been another war, right? In different conditions, but still, nevertheless. So that was an intelligent thing to do, and that's why we find it so astonishing, because aside from the extreme difficulty and the uniqueness of that path, it stemmed from a single person, right? History can really be changed dramatically, as we all know, by a single person. The ancient world was, so taking a step backwards, was inaugurated by great civilizations that rose from roughly the 3rd millennium BC on those rivers in the area that today we call Near East. Remember, always there is a difference between Near and Middle East. So we're talking here about, in part, the Nile, that is also properly Africa. So I don't know how Near East it is conceivable, but also the Jordan, the Orontes, the Euphrates, the Tigris. This is another interesting point to make and to stress all the time, that even Western civilization as we know it, and there is no way to exclude it, but not even way to feel bad about it, because many people probably would, but I don't know, I don't understand at this point why, stems from Eastern civilization, right? Without the Assyrians, without the Persians, there would have been the Greece that we know, right? The Iliad is all drawn fundamentally from Near Eastern heroic models. These populations actually shared a freaking lot with each other, right? Actually, they stem from also very similar origins in a way, but in a certain period in history, the West began to stress the fact that it was something radically different from whatever happened from the other side and from this other side. This is an idea that is still very much believed, also because people tend to look fundamentally at, as always, as we were saying before, at modern times, ancient times, as if, that damned East, right? All the wars there, all the fanatics there, all the extra, they all came from there. We are the best. We've always been the best. No, we weren't. We were barbarians, and we must get, along with the idea. And there is actually, in my opinion, a great pride in saying we were barbarians, but we got civilized, and we came up with something that's objectively surpassed those other worlds in a way, right? So this is not a question of, once again, of competition, because even this statement is pretty weird if you think about it, but that's where we all stemmed from. Again, if agriculture stemmed from 7,000, 10,000 BC, before there wasn't even that, so we all started from some point in which we weren't what we wished we had been. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong? Nothing. Right? There is nothing wrong in saying that civilization, at least as far as the Mediterranean is concerned, stemmed from the East. Right? And before, Europe wasn't that much. Right? And this world, the centrality of the Mediterranean, also, right? For many people, it's not even as far as going to the Near East. They have problems with the fact that everything actually started from the Mediterranean, also from a European perspective. It did, right? There is no doubt about this. That there is the history of civilization in Europe is this constant waves of, of improvement coming from the south, from millennia, right? That's it. There's no other way around it. Right, it's not saying, but metallurgy was advanced, I don't know, in the Sarmatians that gave past it to the Celt. It was just that, guys. It was just that, right? What do you think it was a civilization? The Sarmatians, or Hellenistic Egypt? I mean, just a banal question. There is no way around it. It's just knowing about the quantity of properly the production of the thing, of the advancement of the system. And it's also, by the way, once again, many people are fixated with the ancient world, but do you know in medieval times, I mean, that we studied the Middle Ages of this continuous development that it took with enormous efforts to properly civilize entire chunks of the continent that objectively had not known civilization and objectively were worse than that. So the question here is, why can't we be pacific about this? Why can't we accept that there is nothing wrong about having ancestors that just made it less? I don't know, right? It's true that for a good century in the West we thought of racism, of this scale of civilization for which a people must, be inferior. If by 19th century standards, it hasn't accomplished what was in the most advanced countries of the West, and therefore also in history it had to be like that. Which is not, what wasn't, telling you the truth, it wasn't even true at the time, because like in the 19th century, even if ethno-nationalistic authors accepted something like, I read several German stuff, from that period, and they all recognized that yes, at the time those tribes were fundamentally, primitives. So the question is, and they said it in but this was said by 19th century racist authors that surely attached a lot of importance to the seed of that culture, to the embryo of it, but they recognized that, yeah, they were at certain point backwards, but at least they even contextualized the fact, I don't know, whether of the reality. Today, we even go beyond that. We all fake that they're not Nazis, but we have to say that no, it's all a Roman invention. It's not true. Shutting your eyes and ears and not listening to. Just look at what the material culture was about. Just look at archaeological finds. There is no proportion in this of any kind, right? Do not come up with the bullshit. The Celts were so advanced. The Romans copied all from them. It's not true. It's not true by the slightest. And you think once again that for an armor or a helmet, that's what makes a civilization. I'm sorry, it doesn't. It doesn't, and you don't even know the rest of the history of the world, because just look at the Sarmatians, what they were, nomadic people, and they were definitely more advanced in those fields than even Central Europe. So how do you put that, right? Who was the most advanced? So you have to say the Sarmatians were a greater civilization than Rome. If we want to say that, right? And that comes from a fixed, categorical, encyclopedistic, ironically also illuministic idea of the improvement of civilization, for which racism actually took a great while, for which for you there is no context, for you there is not something that can be produced because a society simply is different, but still there is an obvious difference in development. Right? It's not that if I make great jewelry or great swords, like I can find exceptional in the steppes, I understand the concept of civility. I can't conquer the world. I improve the local production. I manage. Those were cultures that lived like that exactly because that was one of the few things they could do to compensate for the fact that they couldn't do much more. Right? And that's also how to understand a culture. But no, once again, it's always the same old story. The masses today do not understand it, right? Before, historians studied history, right? So that even the most radical had actually a more accurate idea of what they were talking about. Today, the masses pretend to be ideological eunuchs, but come up with these ideas that are way more radical than what even the most radicals in our own history have ever believed. That is called ignorance, and that's called properly tribalism, because let's be honest, you do it exactly and only for that reason, because you cannot accept that at some point you were a brute or a primitive. We all were, all of them. I'm not saying that the specific people that we're talking about at the time were brutes or primitives or barbarians or whatever. They had their own culture, they had their own civilization, but still they improved from the content with more advanced civilizations. What's the problem with that? Why do we have to make moral relativism in the face of an overwhelming documentary archaeological evidence that we all know, by the way, because I presume that if you went to school in a Western country, you should be at least acquainted to the perspective of the dimension of this. I mean, what are we doing this for? If you deny this, you deny Western civilization, because that's how it was created. If you pretend to mess up the order, change the ingredients, that's not Western civilization, right? It's garbage. Right? So let's be honest about this at all levels. That's the only thing I ask. Just look at how the tides are turning. I look at that. I see it often on YouTube. I see certain comments that are disgusting, guys, and hundreds of people, they accept that. Those are presumably all young people. If we still have that problem in numbers with these ideas, we're done for. And I'm saying it very clearly. This is why I make these videos, by the way. So, the Mediterranean. As you know, I'm not a fan of geopolitics. I believe geopolitics does not exist, but naturally geographical factors have an importance, right? Just that it's not decisive, right? It doesn't take just the Mediterranean also there are many people who believe that it's all the Mediterranean because the Mediterranean is special because we had this intrinsic thing. Well, no, we could also be brutes in a way. Hadn't we, as we were saying, being exposed to other realities? It's not just about the geography of it, it's naturally also the climate, it's also the waves of peoples that arrived, and the ones that already existed. It's about the local resources, some very random, think about precious metals and so on. So once again, it's not only the Mediterranean, but definitely the Mediterranean helps a lot as a factor. All these great civilizations of the Near East, right, were except for limited local routes and that were all coastal, right, did not know oceanic navigation. Now, many people view say, well, probably somebody got I don't know, to Brazil, the Carthaginians, but we don't have any certain evidence. Was it possible? I mean, concretely, yes, it was possible. It was absolutely possible, but it wasn't possible. It was possible to get there with a ship and whatever, even just because of an accident in a way. But the question is, there is a great difference between having the mean of going with a ship from Africa to Brazil, and another thing, having the means to implement that route as something remunerative, right? At this time, mining, all think about the logistics of it. It was an enormous cost. Nobody would have benefited from it, right? It's like the thing of the Romans were just about slavery and they missed the opportunity to launch an industrial revolution. The Greeks made it, guys. The Greeks invented the steam engine. Yes, but do you know what they used it for and why? Essentially for games, right? For showing off the local courts. Oh, look, there is a door that opens because of steam power. Yeah, and then what? What do you think the componentistic of availability and capability of production in the ancient world could actually make in terms of steam engine? Right, trying to I don't know, create a locomotive at that time would have starved to death tens of thousands of people. Right, what for? In systems that were unstable, it could be conquered by their enemies from a moment to another. What do you think? That's another radically idiotic thing, right? How do you think the technology had the even just the energetic potential at that time to be profitably applicated? I know it was because of slavery. All the world went on with slavery. Have you wondered why? Like, just randomly, in your mind, have you ever wondered what the whole world function was based on slavery? Maybe because it was the most economically functional to that world, and that maybe, and I say maybe, the people living at that time maybe understood a bit more things about their own world that we do about theirs in turn. Maybe, just maybe, right? No, there would have been no industrial revolution in the Mediterranean. And also the reason why certain specific Hellenic city-states that were definitely very advanced from a technological point of view did what they did is no different from why, I don't know, the Western countries' militaries today have, on average, this very sophisticated and technological armed forces, but still the most important army in the world, the most powerful, is the United States one. That, in proportion, of course, has the know-how that also the rest of the West has, but of course, for needs of practical, managing of its possessions, has a lower average of technological, disposability in its armed forces, right? The fact that the Romans conquered these countries, first of all, they absorbed their culture. So in theory, the point even in there is that if the problem was even just technological, which wasn't, of course, because, by the way, technological improvement at the time was 95% philological. That is, it didn't work scientifically. Secondly, it was just the ideas, right? Simply, why, first of all, would have not the Romans cultivated it, which they did in part, by the way, because they improved also certain aspects of Hellenistic military technologies, but also, why could have not the Greek city-states that fundamentally remained autonomous within the Roman Empire? They had their own government, even their own militias, and so on. Why would have not they improved it otherwise? Because maybe they had previously more money because they were fundamentally trying to expand themselves, like the Ptolemaic kingdom, or I'm talking just thinking about the greatest centers, especially Alexandria, Pergamon, Rhodes, etc. Where there were those specific technological inventions. Of course, because they had enough money that derived largely from extermination, slavery, maybe not directly from rape, but because the world was that one, guys. It's not the projection of 21st technologistic and progressivistic and modernistic delusions on a world that was something very different from what the average person invents it to. But coming back to navigation, the ancient world had developed from these Near Eastern civilizations, centering itself gradually over the basin of the so-called internal sea, the Mediterranean. This is interesting because if you look at it geographically, the center, of those civilizations properly shifted towards the west, and it shifted naturally following the Mediterranean. It's like a route, properly. Right? Now we can't introduce broadly how and why, the peoples that inhabited the Mediterranean were what they were compared to these Eastern peoples and how they gradually, grew. But always remember what we were saying before. Before that, there wasn't much of civilization, right? These are dramatically simple societies compared to our own, right? So it takes really a few to make them develop or not making them developed. And yet, the intensification of context, of activity spreads, right? People learn, people grow, right? It's like a person. The more you know, the more you're effective. So this is exactly what happens in a civilization. That's why the matter of intelligence is really the problem. It's not just about intelligence, it's also probably the moral forces, as always. It's the idea of knowing what you can achieve with, which cannot be properly detached, right? It's, I can't get that, I can't make it, right? Just think about, I don't know, even Greece. The fact, why did, I don't know, philosophy as we know it was born in Greece, right? Rational thinking and so on. Think about communities that were, pressed between the mountains and the sea, and think about a sea like the Aegean, where there is basically no place where you can't see another island on the horizon. You're always with the idea, but okay, I got to this point, so I can't get there. What can I do when I arrive there? You see, when I arrive there, you see other islands. That's something that increases, right? Your curiosity, your applications. It's not just that, right? And to be honest, the thing is very, very complex. As we were saying, it's not just geography of it, but the geography also helped in this regard. And this shift towards the west, right? The gradual shift towards the west. The eastern coastal areas and the ones of the relative hinterland were, however, much more intensely populated and characterized by the centering of important metropolis, right? Than it was, the case for the western ones that were starting to develop in their own kind. There were cities in the rest of the Mediterranean, of course, as well. However, the authentic center of the traffics of the agricultural production and also handcraft production and of the culture property of the ancient world was located in this wide region, was comprehended between the Hellenic Peninsula, the Anatolian one, the course of the Euphrates, and the coasts of Cyrenaica. But also the control of the western basin of the internal sea was important for the grain and the horses of Sicily and northern Africa, the Sicilian sulfur and salt, the Iberian lead, tin, and silver. Right? There are these specific areas where there are particular resources that improved, that are mostly exporters at that point. This is very important to realize, that the fact that the trade balance also was dramatically shifted to the east, and that part of the civilization of the rest of the Mediterranean passed exactly to the activation of these coastal communities to respond to the demands of the bigger market that was from the other side, right? So between the 6th and the 4th century BC, the population of the eastern Mediterranean had been living in the shadow of the hegemony of an imperial colossus, the importance of which we cannot stress enough. It was the Persian one, ruled by the Achaemenid dynasty that had conquered the same Egypt, right? Extending the control on the principalities and caravan centers of Anatolia and the Near East, and conditioning deeply the same Hellenic civilization. The Achaemenid, I'm sorry we stopped to make the series on classical Greece, and we should really resume that because I think it's dramatically important. Maybe starting from some basic history, not just the military stuff, because the importance of the Achaemenid Empire is something that also in the West we have had a lot of problems to properly digest over time. There is probably a way to make it clear. I mean, the fact that the Achaemenids themselves, as Medians, were basically Scythians, they were Indo-Europeans, right? This great empire was, think about Farsi and, just the Persian language. These were part of the same culture back in the day, right? We have depicted often in our culture, during the Persian Wars in Greece, the various Achaemenid invasions of Greece, this idea that we were the Westerners, right, and we hold our ground towards the Eastern barbarity and exoticism and irrationality. That's all 19th century national racist bullshit that unfortunately it's very difficult to get rid of for many reasons, as you understand. But the Achaemenid Empire, first of all, is to be considered really as one of the first great universal empires in history, in a way that surely was more advanced in its properly ecumenic ideal than, the Egyptian, for example, empire really had been about. Why? Well, first of all, it was more extended. Secondly, it also was more advanced, and it was in this sense also emanating more civilization in a way. It naturally came over the shoulders of other great empires like the Sumerian, the Babylonid, the Assyrian one, and it had deep connections with it. Here we should address also the millenary relation of the nomadic peoples of the steppes with this great sedentary area. That is also another very important key to read history of civilization, probably one of the greatest, at least for Eurasia, as far as Eurasia is concerned, obviously, but more specifically because of the importance that Eurasian civilizations reached in the history of mankind. That's also one of the factors that properly stimulated an improvement at many levels in these cultures. But the idea, as far as the Hellenic reality is concerned, first of all, we should point out that the Hellenic cities, and some of the most florid, were properly feeling to be part of the Achaemenid Empire. It's not like the story that, once upon a time there were the Hellenic city-states that, by the way, had also a much longer and somewhat much less, a bit like Rome, right? It's not that these were born as democratic realities, right? The idea of the time of the first invasion of Greece by the Achaemenids was still, characterized largely by tyranny, by the deep connections that existed with the Persian world, and specifically the idea that yes, that Greece was within the Achaemenid Empire, right? There are shades of domination of all great empires that are also properly in here, not clearly outlinable. And definitely compared to the enormous Achaemenid Empire, the Hellenic Peninsula was just, a barbaric midget at the outskirts of the civilized world, right? And this is not to say that the Persians didn't learn the hard way how eventually they underestimated properly the culture of the Greeks, but also we do not have to underestimate as this branch of the Westerners, because there is the Eastern branch that we have forgotten, from which the same Achaemenids stemmed from. And I mean it really from a cultural point of view, in terms of the grandeur of universal power, of the divine, of the idea of the divine, of purity, of nobility, even of chivalry, right? We discuss this quite often. Persia is one of those great civilizations, together with China, with Italy, that brought really something to this world that it's difficult even just to frame in a few words, or if there is any possibility to define them properly, like just properly the emanation of this of this centers, true cores in a way. And even in there was a lot of composition, of course. Like, part of the strength of this reality was the fact that they weren't even in their monolithic blocks. Not even China then passes as the empire that eventually crystallized and died. But that's the 19th century. Objectively, up to the 18th, it's very, aside from the fact that it was objectively the greatest power in the world by the 18th century, it's no doubt. Just look at what the Chinese could mobilize in terms of the Europeans weren't, right? But even there, the cliche that everything is, decadent, and the usual garbage also about the Byzantine Empire. That normally these rallies, of course, have certain almost genetic characteristics. It's very wrong to stress the biological parallelisms between, in fact, living beings and societies, because they have nothing to do actually with each other. But there are certain predispositions that, on the long run, yes, can bring to a relative stagnation, or at least to the difficulty to put up with, to cope with certain other systems. But this is also complex, and we can't talk about it today. But the Achaemenid Empire is truly the greatest empire that had existed in the West up to that point. And we share with it too much, right? It's not true that those weren't us, in a way. It's just also to get rid of racist ideologies, right? If there were literal true Aryans during the Persian Wars, the Persian invasions of Greece, well, the literal Aryans were from the Achaemenid side, right? The Aryans inhabited, north of Persia, and there is even in here all this great world of the steppe, of this world between, there's always been also ambiguous in its composition, because it's never been like the steppe is full of nomadic, right? Some of the greatest centers of the world were created in what most people would say, this is third world, the steppe, there's nothing there. The same Alexandrian civilization, we'll see in a while, actually built its own urban reality largely on pre-existing centers. Think about Antiochia and Marjana, right? Or that would, in the Middle Ages, before the Mongol destruction, was literally the largest city in the world, Merv. So these are the perspectives we need, because in a way or another, we actually are connected to them, right? It's not that those are intrinsically different people. These are the Caucasians, the Indo-Europeans. We come, or our Indo-European ancestors come from there, right? Aside from the peoples that also we found here, and we either killed or copulated with, that we are the consequence of. But specifically, this is important for understanding all that branch. Some of you have criticized me at some point because I made a video on the Indo-Europeans, and threw the term Aryan around. The term Aryan is being a bit erased from studies, but actually it's still there, right? It's still there in normal publications, right, all around the world, from most prestigious and most eventually not nationalist or racist scholars. It's a perfectly fine term. It's actually, from a strictly philological point of view, it's not entirely correct. Now we don't even have the time to explain why, but because it's a bit connected mostly with the Indian side of the story of certain, mostly also the Eastern branch of the Indo-Europeans in a way. But aside, in fact, that's what it sounds strange. It's like Indo-Europeans Europeans would technically be addressed like Aryans, but that's not the point. It should be the other way around in a way. I mean, the Indians are properly what the Vedic and the Arya would have been conceptually. Then the Aryanity of it all, I mean, it can be extended at some levels, but I mean, it's a term you can use as far as you know what it means. It has nothing to do with the older ideologies. These are names and terms that come from far before the Nazis adopted them, and I don't think I don't know, and I don't see why, frankly, since something was used by a totalitarianism back in the day, why we can't use the word, knowing what it means, and in a completely in a fairly neutral term. At least history is never neutral, but not because you want to exterminate other peoples because you think they're inferior, right? You can use the term Aryan without being anything like that. So it's a bit of an obsession, but I sometimes use it, otherwise use it Indo-Europeans. In this case, I think it was interesting because objectively, the Hegemonies even included part of the Earthland, or at least they were in strong contact with the Iranian plateau, with all these peoples that are like literally the whitest you can imagine historically in the history of mankind. So that's exactly the point, right? Already Europeans, in a way, are not even in the fairest standards, objectively are not like the Aryans were in today, as far as we understand. And I don't understand how the general idea is that how you can consider a culture, because I found this, there was a guy who quoted Wikipedia that said something so stupid as, albeit the Aryans or the Indo-Europeans said they were homogeneous from a linguistical, cultural, religious, and whatever point of view, but they weren't from a genetic point of view. Now, my question is, if no people is absolutely pure from a genetic point of view. We all have cross sections. Basically, everything you can imagine exists in the world in our DNA, right? There is no doubt about this. But the question is, why then should culture, language, religion, way of life can be homogeneous, right? That's not homogeneous either. Like, we go by approximation, saying, oh well, they were similar in some ways. We don't know exactly how, but we tendentially think, on the basis of ethnogenetic studies, that's also they were fairly genetically similar at some levels, right? And by other standards, they weren't, because obviously they were also the sum of something else, right? I know that Indo-Europeistics as a whole has been a bit debunked. Also, before I was talking about the Iliad as a most evident, mostly Near Eastern product, rather than, this is quite even from a literary point of view. There is important Indo-European elements in that, but sometimes the problem is that the dichotomy, right? It's either Indo-European, not Indo-European. The truth is that these cultures were very similar at certain levels, so that you can't say that just living as a nomadic tribe in the steppe, it's having a much different culture from other peoples around, and maybe also look less, phenotypically than you, right? Different from you. It's all a difficult ground. It's just the Indo-Europeistics has been very much used, as you understand, especially in the first half of the 20th century, where objectively racist or crypto-racist theories were pretty much on the fore. in the true sense of properly of the racist meaning of the pseudo-scientific ideology that was born in the 19th century, was still alive at the time. Today there is nothing like that. And many publications, even Cambridge, etc., use the term Aryan still, and I don't think it's anything like strange that you can't use, etc. Just be careful with the idea that, yeah, the Indo-Europeans were something kind of unique, and that you can't trace a boundary of what is Indo-European and what is not. Like, language is a useful indicator which shows there was some homogeneity, but at the same time we don't understand like everything. There is a lot of things we do not know, and actually exactly linguistics shows us that lots of the etymologies that we think or we thought were specifically Indo-Europeans, you can find them in China, right? You can find them in Semitic context. I mean, these were all countries that, or peoples that had a very intense connection with each other. And even if they had, by certain standards, were different, still they had a lot in common. Their religion, for example, was something overwhelmingly similar, right? Throughout all, we've seen it, even in the series about animals in the medieval imaginary, like, it's basically all a synthesis of Indo-European, of Semitic, of Arab, of Chinese, ideology. It's all blended together. This is no opinion. This is one of the few matters of fact that is showed by macroscopically, basically by all evidence we have. So, what's the point of keeping to complain even about this? But whatever. Hellenic civilization was surely greatly benefited by the contact with the Achaemenids, and even with the clash with them. They were exposed to this great ideas, to these great intuitions, philosophies, coming from the heartland of the Persian Empire, that was quite advanced, and the same clash with the Achaemenids brought to this dramatic boost in Hellenic civilization. That's where the thing begins properly, and as we would like it to think sometimes, but properly with those characteristics that rose to the stars, literally, as far as just like, I don't know, like the Punic Wars worked for Rome, albeit in a very different way in that case. Rome had a very different and very often much more original, let's say, properly internally created uniqueness, right? And the say Greece too, right? But it was much more directly exposed from a much longer time to the east than the Western Mediterranean was. So the thing is very different. But even in here, we don't have all the time in the world to talk about it. We'll do it on another occasion. Banally, without an Achaemenid empire, there would have not have been an Alexander the Great. Don't know if you ever thought about it, but objectively, it is a lot to do. It's interesting because places like Macedonia and Thessaly were all Achaemenid vassals at some point, right? They were even fine with the invasion of Greece, actually, which they let do, while just basically the Athenians and the Spartans resisted, and a few others. And what I think we overlook is understanding the deterrent power of such empires. Like, it's not that, as I was saying before, that Athens and Sparta just were ultra confident in themselves and said, okay, we exist now to this weird thing that came from the outside. No, these cities believed that they were fundamentally within the orbit of that. It's just they didn't want to be imposed specific things by that empire. They resisted, they made it, and that's also what exalted them, and that's also how much of what we properly consider as not, I would say, as Hellenic culture, because I actually discovered recently that Greece is actually has a much greater continuity in culture than is being previously believed. Like the so-called Hellenic Middle Ages, for example, it seems to have been a literal historiographical invention, and I'm not exaggerating, I swear, and even in there, that there is so much to to see how this culture reacted with the others that it was exposed to and so on. So something different, for example, from Rome, as we were saying before, right? Rome also was influenced by very important civilizations, but fundamentally was an Italic reality that was not dramatically more advanced at the beginning from, I don't know, the Celts or the Barbarians, right? So Greece had instead a very different frame provided is being studied just in these years, and that reveals something very, very important to understand also the roots of Western civilization. But Alexander. So what I don't know why today I started to talk about this. How can you talk about Alexander even just in a video that's not entirely dedicated to him, right? In this feverish and tumultuous 13 years between 336 and 323 BC, a king belonging essentially to an Hellenized Illyrian stock dynasty, and now the wild nationalistic comments will explode. Oh no, he was not Illyrian, he was Greek. No, he was Illyrian, he was Greek. Yeah, I leave that. I even allow those comments because they have the magnetic capacity to attract so much people on the comment sections that I will get tons of views just by that. Yes, we can say, I mean, the Macedonians to me were fundamentally Hellenized Thraco-Illyrians. Let's be honest about it. There were specifically also Hellenic communities that had part. They were a blend, right? But it's important to stress not much the fact that it was Illyrian or Thracian or whatever, but because even in there the differences were much looser than we think. But the fact specifically what Macedonia was, like Alexander the Third of Macedonia, had emerged from this context largely from the accomplishments of his father Philip II, who had fundamentally elevated Macedonia from a state of essentially a broader feudal military aristocracy, right, of estate owners, of breeders and so on, to a real kingdom, right, with a level of centralization as well, as especially because of the silver of Thrace and so on, that could now provide this dramatic army of professionals, even siege engines and considerable technology. But Macedonia, in this sense, was very warlike. Like it's one of those elements of literally of barbaricness in the warlike, in the neutral sense of the term, because objectively, as we were saying before, also these waves of peoples from the steppes brought in, right, for many reasons, because they were hungry in a way, literally. I mean, literally of power and of riches and so on, to create this great dominations, right? The Achaemenids did it. The Macedonians came out relatively quickly and late out of the game, very warlike. But think about many people think about the sea peoples, the Hittites, even the early Assyrians. I mean, they all had this specific warlike character. It's a great invasion. The Scythians had ravaged the Mesopotamia, for example, for centuries, if not for millennia even. So this permeability also of the civilized world is very important. Think about Rome and the fall of Rome and the Germanic invasions and so on. That's the new strength of peoples that lived in other conditions that wanted to also to share, right, in the advantages of civilized peoples, and that eventually ended up to create a syncresis that fundamentally is at the base, and this is probably the thing, from the contrast, from the conflict, from the difficulty, from literally from the problem. You have to invent, to find a solution, and to grow forward. So Alexander is immense. His mind is too great to analyze. We would get lost into it. Easily the greatest commander in the history of mankind, right? I have no doubt about this. a figure that cannot be described shortly. He overturned literally a world, right? He surpassed a great deal um, of the former civilization aspects, because he didn't just create a domination and a new rule, right? He created a synchrosis, right, of universal proportion. It was not just let's say a local negotiate between the local powers, right? It was something that looked at the extension of this rule at the whole world. You would say, but also the Hegemonies did thought like that. Yes, at a level, but the point is that they maintained the primacy of their own stock, of their own kind. Alexander went beyond and fundamentally accepted the idea that all men can rise to the god. He properly surpassed the dimension. This was even in here explaining it was naturally obstacled, attacked, criticized by the same Macedonians. It's all the problems of his of his late years, etc. The synchrosis that the Macedonians didn't want. The Macedonians rightfully believed they had conquered these lands because of their virtue that the gods had given to them. So it was more than just the usual greed, etc. These people believed, like all others, that of course they had deserved this, and they had, right, for the morals of those times. He wanted to go beyond. He wanted to create something never seen in the history of civilization, something that surpassed those differences and truly united in one, right? That's why the megas, that's why the concept of not even an absolute power, but the earthly recognition that of the ultimate power to which everybody would bow, right, including the Macedonians, which was something controversial. Now, I don't pretend to explain you the thing in these few minutes, but surely was based on also this great sense of oneself and this great sense of the accomplishment that this guy had done. I mean, he had literally conquered the world, right? When we think of the entire world, you can say objectively that the Achaemenids, Alexander, Rome conquered the whole world, because it has nothing to do with what the world is really extended, like superficially. It's literally what is the known world at the time, right? And it's obvious that also at the time they knew there was something beyond. Alexander wanted to conquer India, famously enough. He died before he could accomplish that, and it made a lot of sense. It's often overlooked that even the Romans actually wanted to conquer India. Augustus wanted it, but and even here we realize how, in spite of the fact that, for example, Augustus gave properly a European dimension, a continental dimension to the Roman Empire, right? That's the moment, right, in which truly something is born, also in the West by other standards. But the mindset of these Mediterranean rulers was specifically to extend the power to realities that were surely the most remunerative, and that made the that had evident benefits for their earthly rule, but also embodied a sense of grandeur that at the time was recognized as belonging, pertaining to those lands, right? The fact that the outskirts of the world were the outskirts of the world, that Russia is much closer to Italy than India, but the Romans ignored it, and or the fact that they believed that not even the gods had reached as far as places like Britannia, for example. The idea is literally that this world had a different center of power, had a different balance that for us maybe today we do not want to accept it, because we often look in this world the projection of what we have eventually become, even geographically speaking, of the peoples that were civilized in the process, and also civilized others in turn, and so on. But at the time, nobody knew this, right? We know the story, how it went and why. At the time, there were completely different paradigms, and we have to get acquainted to this, because otherwise we cannot understand even the pride and the project of this all, right? Alexander is truly the greatest conqueror in the history of mankind, and his legacy is immense. You cannot say, for example, the Mongols had the same impact in this regard. They achieved also something enormous. Genghis Khan is undoubtedly, I mean, probably second to great, but the idea is that stands behind this universal rule. That is not just a predatory, pride of the steppe. It's something that struggles, even within its own cultures, to improve its own quality, to rise at the levels of the heavens, right? And this is unknown to other cultures. Also, Egypt, Persia, etc., had not had arrived to that, but had showed that at certain levels, but had not fully implemented it. Right? It's as if they stopped to both, as far as their ethnic rule was concerned, or at least even if they shared it to others. About Egypt, right? That there was a foreign rule in there as well, but that were countries that had also grown, can say secularized, because that would be wrong, but I mean also countries like Persia or Egypt were less, in terms of the populace, were more habituated to the idea of a rule. They were more orderly, and they, in that sense, they had also ceased to search as individual peoples for that settlement that instead tormented others. And that's why it's important to point out the Hegemonies were Median, that Macedonia was a borderline in terms of civilization, that Rome also emerged quite quickly essentially from a barbarian background. So the question here is very deep, and it doesn't cease with the accomplishments of that you can metrically measure, right? It's mostly about the philosophy that stands behind it. And in my opinion, Rome and Christianity arrived to one point that in our world, that probably is at the base of our world, that has never been surpassed in terms of conscience and sophistication, of the idea of responsibility, of duty, of service, of compensation, of worthiness, and that's in fact something today we will not discuss, but that I would point at some of the most prominent, if not the most important synchronisms that made Western civilization in its essentials, and with others, of course, there is no doubt about that. But those are not necessarily unique, right? Tribal values, fighting for freedom. It's something you find in many other peoples, and there is nothing specifically European about it, right? Every tribal warrior would fight for his freedom. It's not that others, we know that tribal societies worked in the rest of the world in the same identical way. If you look at Siberia, North America, I don't know, everywhere, the tribes always shared that sense. So there might have been a specific declination in Western civilization eventually of these values, indeed, because everything is blended with the wall, right? That you can't properly take out one factor and to say, okay, without that we would be the same. Probably we wouldn't, but we can say altogether that it was unique in kind, right? In its roots. Alexander began a promise, almost began an evangelion, right? In the true sense, but this maybe we'll see it in another, because it's the idea, literally, of the universalistic promise of living in a world where everybody is not equal, but equally worth in potential, right? That don't think that didn't impact Judaism or Christianity or the Roman mind. The Romans, for example, were absolutely nuts about Alexander. I mean, Alexander dominated, like, together with the Iliad, in a way that it's difficult for us to understand in the ancient world. And it's difficult for us to understand because we have secularized our thought. We can't recognize this anymore. But in those times, you would say, a typical person today would say, well, but think it's not of my culture, therefore I will not, I don't care about it. Caesar wanted to be an Alexander, and he was a proud Roman in a way that also we cannot understand. It was fierce and exclusive and violent and brutal. And then why wanted he to be Alexander? Right? These are the questions that we really look at for explaining what a civilization is, and the literacy we have today towards the idea of a universal value that we are losing in favor of tribalism, right? And even beyond, right? Because still tribalism is not what the tribal reality was at the time, also, right? It's something much uglier, to tell the truth. In some properly in the ideological standpoint, because otherwise, a tribal mindset is very pragmatic, contractual, right? That's it, right? It's also very violent in many ways, but it's simple in its violence, right? It's even fair, if you want. Today's ideologisms are cowardly. They deny reality. I mean, all these peoples we're talking about now, for example, praised speaking the truth above all. If you didn't say the truth, for example, you couldn't reach the heavens in the Achaemenid military value. These people were trained in ways in mentally speaking that we can't even imagine. Today, lying is normal. Today, you're not a piece of trash if you tell a lie. In those times, you were. And you were considered a coward, an unworthy person. And frankly, it's not that lying in absolute terms, but literally on the public arena. I mean, when you own a responsibility, it should be like today, because cowardice is also based on the assumption that you can fool the other, which is an insult, and it's cowardly also because of that. That is not to say that all these great rulers weren't also liars in a way, but they were in ways that, however, didn't take away the realization they could do whatever they wanted if the deity gave them the power to. And that's why they were, more prone to to compromise rather than to the trick, right? I don't know if you get what I mean, but Alexander founded a monarchy that considered itself sacred and universal, in the same way as the Egyptian pharaonic or the Achaemenid Persian one, as we've seen, was. But that, as we've seen also on the linguistical and philosophical level, took a lot from the Hellenic tradition, especially the Athenian one. Think about all the philosophy. Think also about Aristotle, of course. All the Hellenic philosophy that was starting permeating this new way of looking at the world that probably boosted this moral sense, because for the first time, this is what the Greeks have changed the history of the entire mankind. They have told us for the first time that what you would see in a tree for the first time is not just that tree with its own magic, with its own meaning, with its own absolutely original character, but there is in that tree something that you can find in all the other trees, and that is not material. It's not something that, it pertains also to that, but it's something that you can abstract to create a category, which is a rational thinking, which is you can know all the trees at some levels if you know one, right? If you know what is one, or if you know many of them, and you can statistically say, okay, what is that all they have in common? Let's assume that this is a tree. This is a way of thinking that, today you could go as far as saying that it seems banal, but don't think it is. Don't think that even in Europe today we have people that truly understand this difference. And I'm not kidding at all. The idea of a logical, rational thinking is in many ways what also founds this reality, right? There is a lot from from this aspect too that is at the base actually of even of the Romano-Christian tradition, because in many ways they were Hellenistic realities when they rose to the universality of their power. They had been bred into Hellenic philosophy, thought, thinking. So Hellenism is in many ways the godfather of Western civilization, in as much as it also extended its horizons beyond. Right, this happened also before Alexander, but in Greece. But Alexander gave it a full maturity. The idea that there is a centrality that this way of thinking can provide in order to understand the world, which is autonomous. It's not based passively as an authority. That is to say, you're not a subject of the kings of kings of Persia that says one thing. You have to accept it because he has the exclusive blessing of the divinity. So whatever he says, it's more important than you whatsoever. The same goes for an Egyptian peasant that lived whatever the pharaoh said. This is also a very idealistic way. Of course, it wasn't completely like that. It was an autonomy of thinking like that, but it was still framed in an order that wasn't so unprejudiced like the one that the Greeks had invented. I found out, and I repeat it, thanks also to the exposure to these other systems, because it's difficult to come up with that if you are not exposed to civilization. This is not a thought that you could find, I don't know, at the outskirts of Europe. Because in those wars, they didn't even care or need to think like that. The Hellenic position in the Achaemenid orbit, and the wars that followed, etc., are something that deeply shook also that world at its foundations. And we have, I won't repeat it, but I mean, even the idea of how that Western character that we attribute mostly to Marathon, this great, stance to saying we here, is not great because of that. That's something that any barbarian would have done, in a way, right? But and that some Greeks didn't. Many Greeks also were subjugated. Simply, they accepted this passively. Those didn't, but they did it in a way that made them realize that something of that divine power of the kings of kings had passed into them from the heavens, and this had to do with their way of life, with what they had built, with the beliefs that they had. So, as you understand, it's very complex, really, even just to make up our minds, to think of what the history of thought proceeded like in these terms. But Alexander brought this literally to the stars, and he is legitimately the single most the person that had the greatest legacy in the history of the world, right? You can't even properly say even Augustus went as far as that, because Augustus was still living within the wake of that model. In spite of the enormous, Augustus may come easily second, right? Augustus technically was, I presume, the greatest politician in the history of mankind, just to put it plain. But his legacy wasn't as great as the one of Alexander, and he knew that, right? But even in there, we should talk about him at some point, because otherwise it's all chit chat. It doesn't get anywhere. But Alexander began this new synthesis that his initiator gave to itself, that is probably Alexandrian, from the Hellenic world, that conferred common characters on the level of language, of art and culture, the Hellenic one, right? Greek became the common idiom, the koine dialectos, right, of this new cultural synthesis that comprehended, enveloped, and unified the entire Mediterranean basin. Even if it penetrated in different ways within the peoples and the traditions that inhabited the sea. Don't think that even Hellenic colonization made a great difference just a few tens of kilometers inland, because if in the hinterland there was no way to receive this, there were just tribes that they had a few resources, they couldn't centralize, they wouldn't get that, right? They maybe would be exposed gradually to it, of course, even thinking about material culture and so on, but if it's not really the same thing. I mean, it takes a longer time, and especially it takes the Roman conquests to pose these peoples in front of the choice also of understanding this civilization. The point of a common language, think about it. Many people today make relativism also on it. I mean, it's extremely important to have a common language, right? You cannot have a civilization if you don't have a common language. A crazy group of cultures that basically do not talk and do not want to talk is not a civilization. Civilization exists only if there is a compromise and an agreement. If you accept to give something in exchange of something else, as long as you understand that the improvement that you can get from it is greater. That's the intelligence we're talking about. So any kind of obsessional identitarism is actually a denial of Western values. The legacy come out of the overwhelming adventure of Alexander was deep and lasting on the plane of civilization, of customs, of forms of thought, and of art. However, on the political level, what we say the practical level, how to propagate this unity, it was infringed immediately in a plurality of kingdoms, the sovereigns of which were called diadochi, famously enough, that is, successors of the great conqueror. From the empire of Alexander stemmed four great statal entities that were all descending from those generals, I mean the diadochi. The Epirothean, Macedonian, and Hellenic one, we can say it broadly meant, under the Antigonic dynasty, famously enough, the Syrian one under the Seleucid dynasty, the Anatolian one with the capital Pergamon, and naturally the Egyptian one under the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Seleucid one is the one that went the closest, basically, to recover Alexander's legacy, to recollect Alexander's legacy, but they never fully succeeded in many levels. We made interesting videos about the Seleucid army and also explaining there what was the attempt of basically creating that syncresis, even from a military point of view. We will come back on all of these. I think except for the Ptolemies, we made already a video more about all of these three others. And around these states that new different developments, right? There was, however, the framing of a series of minor powers. This is important because the Alexandrine legacy lived on in this sense. I mean, it's not that by the collapse, the vanishing of Alexander's empire, nobody cared. Right? Say, okay, well, this thing happened, let's go back to what we were before. Everything changed. Everything, right? The interesting aspect is naturally that the syncresis had preserved largely the local cultures, right? We can't talk specifically of a Hellenic, Persian, Egyptian, or Semitic culture blended all together. I mean, these states here that we just listed are fundamentally that. I mean, think about the Ptolemies. They controlled fundamentally Egypt, Palestine. They made 5 wars over Syria. They were fought in Lebanon, also they lost actually Jerusalem. Also the Seleucids reconquered it, whatever. but they had Cyprus, they had certain cities at a point in Asia Minor, even in Thrace, right? If you look at the details of it, Lysimakia, for example, at some point was Ptolemaic, so you can imagine the multi-ethnicity of it. Actually, the Ptolemaic kingdom was probably the most syncretical one, also thanks to the greatness of Egyptian civilization before. It was probably the most, it was more syncretic in the sense that especially the Hellenic customs adapted most to the ones of the natives. The Seleucid Empire also was exterminated. I mean, it had mostly this Semitic base in the sense that, aside naturally from the Hellenic dynasty, but Macedonian dynasty, they ruled over Mesopotamia and Syria that are Semitic, but they controlled places sometimes, at times like even Galatia, at least as a sort of vassalage. They had Iran, they had Persia, right? So yeah, I mean, it's those powers that even the Antigonids, as we were saying before, had covered this broader Thraco-Hellenic Illyrian reality. From Corinth to Ambracia, right? From Thrace to Aetolia. I mean, they had surely even in there an interesting set of cultures that all benefited from and also places like Armenia, for example, they were technically independent, or even Bactria that seceded from the Seleucid Empire. But think about even the Indo-Scythians and so on. They all lived in the legacy of Alexander, right? And naturally, here we haven't made the importance differentiation. That is, of course, that these were properly kingdoms, if not empires, especially the Seleucid Empire with Arches Seleucia. Egypt and Macedonia technically were kingdoms, but these were something extremely different from the ideal of the Hellenic city-states. I mean, in classical terms, for an Hellenic city-state, the Macedonian rule was pure tyranny, right? It was against any democratic value it had. It was considered like barely truly Hellenic in that sense. But naturally, also there was a pride of the most evident fact that surely these Macedonians spoke Greek at the time. They expanded the Hellenic culture and so on. So even in there, it's complicated. Even to trace a boundary, to say, okay, here begins this culture, here ends this one. It's exactly in the Alexandrine character that you can't do this because it's a syncresis. So you can't divide the two things anymore. And this is also the point, that these areas were never eventually properly brought under something else. You would even say that Christianity and Islam were literally obsessed by Alexander. Islam even more than Christianity, to tell it all. So we can say that Alexander still shapes the world we live in at so many levels, and it's mostly our own modern incapacity to realize how much it mattered at the time and why these peoples all drew from this model that reveals the fact we are not worthy of expressing a judgment on these realities. We should digress once again. Why did? Of course, it was a specific interest. Everybody wanted to be the next Alexander, even if it was an unreachable model. Nobody achieved it, but there was in there probably a civil accomplishment that was really functioning on the basis of the coexistence and the action of all these chunks from standpoints that were very different but that found each other all to act together. And now we have to stop it because otherwise it will be really too long. But it means that even a kingdom like the one of Armenia, for example, was heavily Persianized in culture at certain levels. Now, was heavily Hellenized at certain levels too, etc. But I could number many, right? Also, certain Hellenic colonies. Think about Syracuse. Think about Dionysius of Syracuse. Those were technically city-states, but that emerged as a sort of an imperial mindset surpassing therefore whatever the Hellenic polis had been technically, um, and wanted to emulate Alexander. And many rulers at the outskirts of this world were very reverent, like they were truly scared of it. For example, had Alexander invaded the Balkans, it's pretty natural. I mean, he already did by part, but had he eventually ever marched into, I don't know, Cisalpine Gaul, had gone for the west, which was unlikely. He just wanted to conquer Arabia, Carthage, and then eventually go to India. But had he done that, these peoples, especially the Balkanic ones, were already more, and were acquainted to Macedon since a long time. They would have kneeled in front of him, because they recognized in this military might, right, in this enormous accomplishment, something truly divine. And don't think that even other populations didn't think that. But that's exactly the dichotomy of the ancient world. It was about the choice between either you stand against the divinity or not. And the ugly side of it is that you would disappear if you if you lost. Not just because you would be physically destroyed, but also because you would have been destroyed by the deity, right? And just think in this, a bit to spoiler, how much it meant for Roman civilization to extend its citizenship to the subjected peoples. That's the other truly unique thing that is unique in the entire history of mankind. Nobody ever did it, right? If not as a Roman legacy, till to this day. That was also something that was never attempted before. And the Roman Empire lasted, a tiny bit more than one of Alexander, also incorporating its great part of its domains. Let's say that under the economical and cultural profile, the great metropolis of the 4th, 3rd century BC were mostly Alexandria. It was capital of the Hellenic Egyptian kingdom of the Ptolemies, with its great port, its most famous library. Antioch was the Seleucid capital, at least after Seleucia. And in the 2nd century BC, however, there was a revival, a resurgence of the Persian Empire, we can call it in this way, under a dynasty of Parthian origin, the Arsacids. That the Parthians themselves were fundamentally a people akin to the steppes, coming from the east of the Caspian Sea and settling in the north of the country, in Media, a bit like the Hegemonies had done. And this limited decisively to east the Seleucid hegemony, because originally the Arsacids were actually Seleucid vassals. They even made expeditions to bring these eastern provinces under control. It was very difficult, actually. But at certain points, these peoples were, fine. They mostly began to expand when also the Seleucids began to crumble at home for reasons now we don't have the time to explain. And they emerge as this power that mostly makes its presence felt for a long time on the caravan routes between Syria and the basin of the Indus River, the Silk Road, right? And also the ones between Syria and southern Arabia, in turn connected to the maritime routes that brought towards the Mediterranean the spices of India and of Eastern Asia, the incense road. Conversely, the Ptolemaic kingdom remained for Egypt had often this role historically, a long time, the capacity of gravitating the Emporium of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile, an area of exchanges, of market exchange that went from the coasts of the Levantine Sea to Greece and southern Italy, was coastally, as you know, very Hellenized, Magna Graecia, or Magna Graecia if you prefer, to the Red Sea as well, to the also mountain chain of the Atlas in northwestern Africa, to Nubia, and to the Iberian Peninsula. So think about just the range, and when you have such range of influence and of exchanges and capacities, you cannot but emanate civilization. You cannot but grow intelligent and aware and resourceful to cope with all these realities and to why? Because you're essentially sorting out ever more complex systems. It's a mathematical function, right? So the Mediterranean basin was unified from an economical point of view, but also from a commercial and productive one that comprehended in reality the Nile Valley up to Ethiopia with its routes of gold, of ivory, and of black slaves from deep Africa, into the so-called Arabia Felix, the southern area of the Arabian Peninsula that was rich in agriculture and had this prestigious position at the entrance of the Red Sea. Objectively, southern Arabia is probably one of the most overlooked civilizations in the ancient world. It was actually a pretty amazing thing. There were lots of cities, especially in the southwestern corner towards Ethiopia, on the Red Sea, and they had an amazing. The Marib Dam was also this enormous infrastructure that allowed this good agricultural exploitation and so on. So we're talking about a complex system, as you understand, that was fueling itself, was growing in many ways. Wasn't just like a positive random growth. Like they worked pretty damn hard to make it work well, right? So coming back to Rome, that in this starts appearing because the conflict with Carthage obliged around the mid 3rd century BC the Roman Republic to inaugurate a maritime policy and at the same time pose herself through the connection of the Hellenic Italo-Mediterranean colonies in contact with the prestigious Hellenic, actually Hellenistic at probably this point, culture. Actually, Rome had connections with that even before Alexander, so it's even fine to say Hellenic in a way. Also, the Etruscans were interestingly Hellenized at some level, and the Romans, even since the beginning, before these times, by a certain degree. So, from then, the gradual control of the entire Mediterranean basin and the entrance of Rome in the area dominated by the Koine dialectos of the Greeks had been at different levels the common objective of Roman aristocracy and of the great gentes that were the senatorial families. And as it's often said, that the Romans were, conquered Greece and they were eventually conquered in turn by Hellenic civilization. It is indeed true. I mean, the Romans, as we said, seen many times, actually had a dramatic boost. Like the development of Roman civilization was extremely fast, and it conferred certain specific characteristics that helped a great deal also for the further developments, because the Greeks, if you wonder why the Greeks didn't like to expand their civilizations, to expand their citizenship to others, to the barbarians, and Rome did actually, it's in part for this, right? It's in part for the realization from the Hellenic side that they were something older, more structured, and therefore it was more resistant, culturally speaking, right? Less flexible. Rome instead emerged from a background that made it understand dramatically how important was the connection and the sharing with other communities, because without the extension of Roman citizenship, the Romans would have not come out of Latium, not even Italy at that point. And that we have to be all thankful for, because I believe that there was a dramatic benefit to the world civilization thanks to this specific Roman attitude. There was also the ruling class. Among the ruling class, the equites, the knights, were entrepreneurially and commercially active, and of the proletariat that spotted in its only hopes, but the possession of small plots of agricultural land and in the military service. So we all know a bit Roman politics and society. There was a tension, an inherent tension between conservative and landed aristocracy from one side and, let's say, call it democratic environments is a bit too much, but let's say that there were certain other realities, even in the middle class, objectively, yes, that were opened to the cultural, the Atlantic and even Eastern cultural penetration. This is a bit, I have to talk about this in Roman history because we didn't make many videos objectively yet. But the idea is naturally that the landowners wanted mostly a more closed economy to preserve their goods, their agricultural products. Instead, more dynamic and active classes wanted to exchange trade with trade and to extend its the markets and so on. So to render the whole system more competitive. This is one side of the story. Don't think that, I don't know, that the senators or the knights, for example, had a dramatic aim. Like they all wanted to become to remain for the knights to arrive at the same level of the senators, right? It was just depending on which stage you personally were. Right? There isn't much idealism in all this. But as we were saying before about Scipio, that's it, right? The idea, especially of extending rights also to new populations in order to control them, was a problem because that we find even at the time of Caesar, at the time of Claudius, at the time of Nero, and that understood that the only way to keep alive the empire was to keep integrating these new forces that could strengthen it. And objectively, that was the reason why the empire lasted so long. Other empires didn't have that formula in many ways. And not even the end of the Roman Empire in the West, for example, was directly connected to it. There were other changes that unfortunately had much more to do with the internal balance of the empire in terms of production and demographic capabilities than really what this system was. The proof being the eastern half continuing for another millennium and without excessive internal problems. That is to say, they basically resisted to an avalanche of peoples that also the previous Roman times never seen in that mass, in that as a threat in that proportion. This is a bit the dichotomy that naturally also within Roman society that is also warlike, as we've seen. It is, at this time, naturally, the Romans were more advanced than, I don't know, what the Macedonians in the time of Philip II and Alexander III had been, right? But they hadn't lost, however, their imperialistic and, expansionistic idea, and especially the certainty that they were destined to rule the world. That's what the Romans thought. The Romans rise up with this belief that is purely religious and military, just like all the other empires, but that manifests itself with this deep conviction that it was them, right? They were the chosen people, and they proved right that they were at the level because what they accomplished had never been seen in the history of civilization. We cannot compare even China to this because Rome, as we've seen, in terms of this civil connection, is unique. It's something based on the munus, on the idea that you have to earn your citizenship. You have to give something in turn to receive something, and that's a great idea. It's something that places the emphasis not on the idea that, there is a central ruler, a celestial ruler, everybody obeys. No, you are directly and personally involved with your own responsibility in this specific task. You cannot say that this wasn't a civilization and that the other tribes next to it that were swallowed by Rome were better because, poor deers, they were exterminated, and who knows what they had been doing up to that point with their neighbors, by the way. Rome gave them an option, first of all. I mean, other empires would normally wipe you out, and yeah, there were ways of cooperating and so on, but Rome gave you an opportunity, right? And of course, many were not interested in the opportunity. And the Romans, just to prove that there was no hypocrisy, the Romans actually had usually estimated those peoples who stood against them, because they knew that they understood that language. They knew that they would have done the same in the same identical situation. But they were sure they would win. In fact, they did. And however, Rome usually behaved like this. If you stood against Rome the first time, you would be crushed, but there was chances some of you would still remain standing. If after being subjugated, you wanted to cooperate, you could even become a Roman. For real, that is not a slave, it is a Roman citizen with all the rights that you can wave in front of the emperor as a freeman, right, in front of the military and celestial deity of the sky, right? And theoretically, everybody could do it, right? It's obvious that, like in any pre-industrial society, the overwhelming majority of people still lived in as peasants. It was kind of bad, but here we're talking about the possibility of being freed, right? And not just being freed, but to become properly part of a civic system, which you were recognized not just as one of the stock, but as an absolute freeman in a system of the chosen empire, of the chosen people. So this is far beyond like saying, also barbarians freed their slaves. Yes, but then what, right? What was the rest of the opportunity? Keeping just to fight all the time in those conditions of instability, to risk to be enslaved once again. I mean, Rome was something that worked because extended this rights since the very beginning in a compromissory way. So the myth that Rome was just a cruel, a heartless, cruel exterminator, it's false. Because if Rome had made wasteland around it, there would have not been even room to colonize these places, to make it work. Rome wiped out enormous amount of people, of whom we do not know even the name today. But at the same time, those who were left weren't the next slaves, right? Or at least those who had opposed them in arms, of course, would become, because they had made their choice. And Rome did horrible things even in that regard. Most of this integration was based on extortion, right? But at the same time, we know how things went. We know how many cultures remained under Roman domination. I mean, once again, look at Italy, look at Gaul, the Iberian Peninsula. I mean, it's not that they or Greece, right? It's not that Rome arrived and destroyed everything it found. These weren't destroyers of the steppes that couldn't maintain these places because they didn't have the instruments, and therefore they would raise it to the ground to make loot. These were a fully integrated system with the rest of the world. And it was naturally understood as and in fact, even the permeability to Romanization had a lot to do with civilization itself. Rome didn't kill as many people as it did in Central Europe, for example, as it did in the East, because in the East, after all, it squeezed the place. It did worse things in a way, but it kept standing what already existed because it was functional. If in another place you find just people that oppose you in arms and no possibility of making them even accept your market, your artifacts or something, because they don't know what to do with that, and they resist. Many didn't resist. I mean, many were, many people in Central and Northern Europe were even subjugated without a fight, right? They weren't stupid, right? Also, these people didn't surely like to get exterminated en masse. They understood that there was another way, but others did. And surely this has to do with the imposition of this rule, but also with the probably from the other side, not much farsightedness as far as the absolute ideal of freedom was concerned. Right? Absolute freedom is not necessarily something positive. Right? We distinguish positive and negative freedom. Doing whatever you want, because that's literally what it was, and as we've seen, doing what you wanted at the time was doing exactly what the Romans did, that is exterminating, enslaving, and raping. That is what all other peoples regularly did, and especially in tribal cultures. I mean, in Greece or in Egypt and so on, the wars would bring the consequences that you can imagine, but they were much more stable systems, right? And by themselves, they wouldn't be entire realities wiped out. These are civilizations that they lived within the Achaemenid Empire, the Alexandrian Empire, and the Roman Empire, because they were there, they functioned, they were to be integrated. In fact, something that Rome inherited from Alexander was this Hellenistic ideal of essentially not having even to draw the swords out in order to receive formal subjugation, right? And that happened, and naturally the conditions of these people were much better than the ones that decided simply to oppose Rome. And incidentally, those who opposed Rome were in a way those who had less chances at the beginning. Just for saying, I don't know, even when we talk about famous rebellions, at some point everybody was forced to do it. Think about Germany. I mean, Rome conquered Germany in a few times, ruled there for 25 years. Then, with the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, you see what was the grip on those places. The Romans underestimated, at least Varus seemingly, what the nature of these peoples was, and that's where the Germans took up arms. But before, they had been bent like anybody else, and that's the mechanism of it that also makes you tell that it's not that those were different realities from others. Think about the Gauls. Those, for example, understood much, perhaps more unitarily than the Germans, that what the problem really was. They understood it, however, late, but Caesar's invasions was lightning, was 8 years, right? So, however, these are all relative aspects. The central point is a bit here I will not say that, I don't know, that there was a democratic aristocratic part, right? The idea of the populars and the optimates, let's say, is a bit, they were the same people, they were doing the same things, just with different propaganda in a way. I mean, let's be honest, Caesar was a popular, but was one of the most prestigious noblemen in Roman society. The myth that he was poor decade is garbage. There is no evidence of that. This is just the fact that there is a poor documentation for some time, but about the family. But the few information that we have is that they had the highest posts in Roman politics and so on. So we know of the dichotomy between Sulla and Marius, Pompey and Caesar, and so on, and eventually between Octavian and Antony. That the latter being both heirs of the political message of Caesar, and however Octavian had also partly collected especially the conservative Pompeian legacy in a way. You would say, oh wow, Octavian Pompeian, this is something that you don't hear often. Well, in part surely Octavian, if you think how he rose to power initially, sided not with the, sided with the elite in a way. So yes, he was Caesarian. We will have to look at that chapter, but Antony was actually much more Caesarian than Octavian. Indeed, it is true. As it's actually not true that Antony was this Eastern, obsessed. That was a typical propaganda that existed in Roman society. It was very traditional still at the time regarding Hellenism in a way. but it's just political propaganda. I mean, we know that it worked. It was one of the most sophisticated ones in history, like mostly political propaganda is. And the fact that 2,000 years after, you could at least know that it is propaganda instead of falling into it. We would know better. Oh, I love Octavian, so I'm not making a point. I'm just saying how that's clever, and that's specifically what we should look at when realizing also in there what's the civilization that Augustus properly say founded but implemented as a system, as a balance. Also, Octavian and Augustus, as the same name says, actually was collecting an Hellenistic legacy. Octavian became hegemonic. The Senate had attributed to him this honorific and inaugural title of Augustus that in fact comes etymologically from Sevastos. That was one of those terms of Hellenistic use that rulers had. It means he who increases basically his own power, but it has different meanings. From augere also in Latin, but whatever. And that whom he had also they had also recognized as princeps, that is, the first and most authoritative among the senators, that however as noblemen considered themselves as their own peers. Technically all the Romans, this was the idea also in the free world, all citizens are noblemen. This is a concept that also you rarely hear, but if you look at even other civil realities, the idea of freedom is associated necessarily in this world to nobility. Classist interpretations of history in this sense are pretty idiotic. It's obvious that the proletarians were really people who had nothing but their own children, but and there were deep social divides. A Roman Republic has never been democratic by the slightest. It's always been an oligarchy in all its phases. The people never ruled. It was always the elite. But the concept is that the citizenship equated all the Roman citizens to freemen in the same way. So that's something that the Romans took very carefully to consideration, not because of a secularized thinking of a modern power, of say the equality of it just for the sake of itself. You were a Roman citizens because theoretically you had deserved, you or your ancestors, because that's how the thing actually worked, had deserved it by serving Rome, which mostly meant serving an imperialistic power. So it was about receiving that, as we've seen, celestial military glory of the skies, and that's why you were a Roman citizen, and why there was a sacredness about it, in a way. And that makes it highlight much more clearly, also from a properly civil point of view, what the conceptualization of this citizenship really was compared to what happened to the rest of the world. Rome was basically recognizing to the peoples to whom extended its own citizenship that they were eligible for that glory. Right. In this sense, if you look at the history of the Roman Empire, it makes it's even more meaningful regarding to the moral decline of this thing that we bring back from Gibbon and so on. That today is debunked, but there is a bottom of truth in this. I mean, in the softening up of the morals, right? It is true, right? It's not as true, let's say, as, for example, the elites were concerned, but about the rest of the people, surely yes, as we will see in a while. And surely the Augustan system gave rise to a new political regime that was characterized by centralization from the side of the princeps of a series of powers and prerogatives that, however, didn't compromise, at least formally, the asset of the res publica. That was the official name of the Roman Empire, the res publica populi Romani, right? So the Republic of the Roman people, but republic in the term as it was intended before, not which is in turn because publicus derives from the same people, right? So I will spare you the philological problem here because we do not know the answer for sure, historically speaking. Nobody knows. It's very unclear. And it's very complicated, to tell the truth. But, of course, Augustus once was a monarchy, right? At least it had objectively a monarchic element. The title of Rex, however, was absolutely abhorred by the Roman tradition and political culture, which is also very, very important because just for understanding also the further developments of the West in the Middle Ages, right? The East was really used to a monarchic idea, right? Even if imposed or passively accepted in a way, Alexander had been a king. The Romans didn't know this. The concept of emperor is something very different. Very different. In fact, actually, when we talk about empires, we should be very careful because, as before, we were saying arche seleuke about the Seleucids, we say empire. Arche is, yeah, in Greek, it's something relatively different. It's not hegemonic because there is properly hegemon as a linguistical choice, but properly the superior. I mean, the guy who stays at the top, but it's still a form of empire. But our terminology of empire comes from Latin, and that's only that one. The Hegemonies were kings of kings. That's how they formulated the thing. I sincerely don't know in Egyptian what pharaoh meant, but I suppose it's much more totalizing, of course. And the Romans didn't go on with a monarchy. That's the interesting thing of it. The Romans maintained the idea of individual freedom even within the greatest empire of the world, and this was not granted by the complacency of the great king, right? That could say Cyrus the Great, for example, wrote beautiful things about the fact that in theory that didn't have to be slaves in the empire, which actually there were, that everybody had to be paid equally and so on. It's big propaganda, but the idea is that he was granting it. In Rome, it was not. In Rome, it's the Roman people who makes the thing. And naturally, this is, you would say, but also the Greeks actually in the polis did that. Yes, but aside from the fact that even in their radical democracy, it's been just in Athens for a while. And in any case, it failed. But secondly, the Romans do not care about their own polis, we could say, even in Greek. Because Rome objectively is a city, right? Like the Greek ones, conceptually, in the sense that even the Greek city-states derive from the Near Eastern city-states in a way, because there were. So it's something, if you want, even probably not European, if we want to be honest. But it maintains. It's just like a container filled with this idea of barbarity, right, in the neutral sense of the term, that is every freeman is a warrior and owns as part of this people the military glory of the sky, the ultimate freedom, right? So it's even here it's complicated to explain it, but the concept remains at the roots of the Roman Republic, so much that what Rome does is fundamentally extending Rome to the rest of the world, and Rome is literally the city. The Romans found many new Romes all around the empire. Roman colonies, it's literally Rome. It has the same thing. It has the Forum, it has the Temple of Jupiter, it has those specific, even architectonic or urbanistic characters that are, you have to be just like Rome. And people became Romans, and they were extremely proud of this, right? To Algeria, from Algeria to Germany, we have examples of people who proudly claimed themselves even after the dissolution of western half of the Roman Empire by the 7th century. A city like Trier in Central Europe, those citizens said, we are proudly Romans. We have evidence of this. We have literal documents. They were extremely proud of because also they were properly citizens. This is something that lives on very much. I mean, if you look in communal Italy, all the tradition stemmed objectively from the Roman city. Here, we have to be, the city is not another version of lifestyle, like, riding, living in a tent in the steppe or in a village in the forest. The city requires an organization, a development, a capacity that other peoples in that sense do not have. Also, that's why it's important to stress the derivation of all this from the Near East, from Greece, Rome, etc. Because other, there are many cities around the world, and they form naturally in a way. But specifically here in the Mediterranean, the thing gets accelerated. That there is a model of imitation. Even, I don't know, the Celts, especially in the most advanced, in the richest areas like in Gaul, in southern Britain, they had, in Spain, they had this proto-urbanism being formed because they were enriching themselves to the point that they were starting to build the basis of that. But obviously not achieving it. Actually, cities are built just because the Romans arrive and built, but on the base of the previous oppida, that are something very different. They're basically just entrenched camps and fortified citadels and so on, but there's no civic ideal in there. But surely the power of it was seen from these other peoples that wanted and needed to become like the rest. So there is no alternative model wishing that your civilization is something that is not civilization. Civilization speaks a universal language, and putting it in relative terms is just lunacy, right? People lived better in these places. There were exactly in the richest, most advanced areas. We've seen also in the Celtic world, the Oppida are born just in certain places. At least they develop the most in certain places because they are the places that are more advanced. We know it. The central Gauls, the southern Gauls, they had magistracies that were, fairly advanced. So you can't say that's an, I don't know. It's just, I don't know. I don't know even how to put it there because you'd say, and people would say, "Oh, that's a Gallic invention." No, it's a universal invention to live in a city, right? Once you have enough resources to collect there. So, what maintained the reign of Res Publica Romanorum, starting from the Augustan Principality? We are used to define it Roman Empire, but actually, the term of imperium actually was about properly the right to rule, that is to say, to emanate laws and to inflict sanctions, that is to say, to rule proper, and it was done sword in hand, was original in Roman society, was religious, was properly associated to war, telling the truth, and decision, right? He who commands decides, also other things, and it was at this point an original mixed system characterized by the authority of magistrate, to whom was attributed the honorific title of imperator, right? General that, following to his victories, has obtained the right from the honorific ceremony known as the triumphus. That resumed within itself some prerogatives. For example, the highest pontiff, that is the presidency of all the sacerdotal colleges present in the state, the consulship for life, the tribunate of the people, that included the veto right, and over the laws emitted by the Senate, and the command of armed forces. And naturally the Senate itself, that remained the fons juris, that is the source of law, that is the supreme magistracy capable of promulgating, of emitting laws. So at the time it was a mixed system, of course. It was literally in many ways reflecting the development, the articulation, the complexity of it. Rome ruled an enormous territory already by this time, and you need an administration, and that's something that the Romans had developed gradually in all this. And the emperors, albeit being in line of principle holders of an elective office, tended, however, since from the immediate successors of Octavian Augustus, to found dynasties and to transmit their power to their heirs and descendants, let's say. It was informal, but it was recognized with certain institutional fictions, right? And the main problem, actually, of the Principate was the succession. and they had their point of strength in the support of the democratic institution and par excellence of the republic. That was the legionary army. We discussed about the beginning of the Roman army and the strongly public meaning of it, right? The Roman army you talk about is properly the army of the Roman people, not much of the feudal elite that in archaic times actually ruled Rome. So there is a diarchic balance that towards the Senate that controlled naturally through the various families and their holdings enormous entire provinces sometimes. It was so there was a balance between the two, and was expressed through a repartition of powers that included even a territorial, in fact, distinction between imperial provinces directly governed by the emperor through his delegates, and the senatorial ones instead held by special functionaries. And it was also fatal in certain circumstances that the emperors assumed ever more the formal and symbolical characters of sacred monarch, Dominus ac Deus, right, on the model of Alexander that was at the same time inspired to the Egyptian pharaohs and the kings of kings. So this eventually would evolve, as you know, into something more monarchic, and here now presenting this all in a phrase, it's a bit it's too courageous to say the least. In fact, I don't think I rendered the idea, but this is just for telling you exactly what the possibility, right, of civilization actually was, right? The idea that this thing took all of these powers, all of these rulers, all of these changes broadly meant, and wars and expansions and so on, to fix something more, constructive, but that is essentially like everybody put a patch on, a new important patch on it, and that is very random if you think about it. It might have not gone this way. It would have been what would have been the West without Alexander the Great? What would have been the West without Augustus? Surely not the West, right? Something different. And we don't have to give it for granted because it's literally one person, and you can understand all the other things that actually changed it in the meanwhile and how different could have been. Even in here, I presume that in all these experiments there is a common universal language. Indeed, I mean that tendency towards improvement that we were talking about at the beginning surely passes through the tendency probably also towards a specific way of rule, at least for the level of complexity of our societies that are that need an order that is you cannot but compromise because it's become too difficult to maintain. So what I would like to leave you with is something that I expressed on other occasions, and that specifically concerns our difficulty in modern times to conceive ourselves as capable of proposing a universal model. Right? History has always been done by negotiation, by compromise, but it's also important what moral force you put in it. Right? Look at our own world today. Do you feel that there is a common push, motivation, or something that you can think to outline on the base of a universal meaning that concerns all men and women, and that is about the world and humanity and its whole existence? Sure, there are things like human rights and so on, but that still sounds like a pretty negotiable thing. That is to say, it's not that human rights cannot be suspended in case, for example, of war, right? And of course it was like that also at the time, but that's exactly the point. Like there is a utilitarian sense of them that derives most. Okay, it works like this. People want it. Let's have it. Let's enforce it for further stability. There is surely a value of that kind. But regarding the I don't know, maybe we are distracted by all the problems and this stuff, but properly about a unitary idea, an idea of what the world should be. Nobody comes up with it anymore, right? We gave up, I presume, with the invention of the nation state. That, in a way, is like creating your more advanced tribe compared to the past, and that, however, at some point will have to be incorporated into an ever greater empire, even the one of Augustus thought. And do you think we have another Alexander, another Augustus in these times, given our education, the parcelization of our competences, of responsibility? No. So sadly enough, I think that we will improve, maybe even very well in detail, but we will never have, at least given the current situation, a new comprehensive ideology that can answer all the questions. We tried that, but if you look at the history of philosophy, there are attempts of this kind. There is an attention specifically to the idea, but at the same time, it's also the attempt of it's a failed attempt, right? And this is also very meaningful. Science probably might be an answer. That is to say, becoming ever more rational. It's probably the way. It's not by denaturating yourself, by taking away your feelings, but making your mind ever more powerful to pursue your dreams and what you think is valuable. But that cannot happen without intelligence, and intelligence is based on education. So until we want to invest in that in a way that has never been conceived before, we will not have it. We will not. And we will not be able to create a new language, something that doesn't just stem from the mediocrity of the newly raised, we can say masses, but specifically people who do not care anything about education, because let's be honest, most people just think it's something boring or useless. We can do better, I presume. Well, however, this was kind of crazy. Never made a video with this breadth of idea like it, but and probably, as always, every once in a while make videos that someone dislikes, but most of you are actually very positive about it, so I understand if you don't listen to me or if you actually agree. I say things that are controversial, like for many standards, because I doubt that. Honestly, I've never heard a person that reasons the way I do. I mean, that has that specifically says actually the things that I do, because they're either I can say they're simpler specifically, because otherwise I think who knows what about what I say, but specifically I try to put in this whole thing all what can do, right? That is, it's not the easy cliche, it's not by seeking confirmation or support from what you think, it's properly coming up with something new. I mean, if you take away that creativity, and for an improvement that objectively is needed at some point, the question dies. That's how I leave this. That's how I feel it, and I presume it is how it should be, right? But anyhow, let's stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.